Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Antelope Hill Book Club. We are your hosts. My name is Taylor Young,
I'm Sean Bell.
and today we'll be discussing the novel Michael by Dr. Joseph Goebbels. Paul Joseph Goebbels was born in 1897 in a town near Dusseldorf, Germany. His father was a factory clerk. His family had pretty working class roots. They were devout Roman Catholics. Goebbels himself considered going into the clergy at one point in his life, and then over time developed a much more complicated relationship with Christianity. He had a physical deformity due to a birth defect. He had one leg that was shorter than the other. He wore a metal brace and walked with a limp for all of his life. For this reason, he was rejected from military service in World War I. So unlike Hitler, he was not a veteran of that war. He completed his gymnasium in 1917 at the top of his class. At that point, he was considering going into the clergy. He afterwards studied at 5 universities, including Munich and lastly Heidelberg, both of which appear in the book Michael. He received his PhD in philology in 1921 and wrote Michael in 1921, although it was not published until 1929, and this is generally reported to have been something that was against his wishes. So that would have been a few years before the Nazis took power in 1933. He joined the NSDAP in late 1924, around the time that Hitler was released from prison after having served 1 year of his 5-year sentence for the beer hall putsch. When Goebbels joined the Nazi Party, his member number was 8,762. He served as the Gauleiter of Berlin for the Nazis from 1924, and after 1933, the Reichsminister of Propaganda. The other office that he held after that was Chancellor of Germany for 1 day, in accordance with Hitler's will, on 30th April to 1st May, before he died by suicide with his wife Magda and their 6 children on 1st May. There's a number of similarities between him and his character Michael that we'll go into at some point. He is somewhat infamously a lifelong womanizer, and also less well known is he always wanted to be an author. He wrote 14 books throughout his life. He started a diary in 1923 that continued for the rest of his life, and he also wrote 2 plays. The novel Michael is based to some degree on his own experiences, as well as the experiences of his friend Richard Flieskes, who was a veteran of World War I and later a miner and died in a mining accident in Schliersee in 1923, the same town in which the main character Michael also dies of a mining accident, although in the book it's in 1921. The book takes place over about a year and a half from 1919 to 1921, and is written also in diary form from the perspective of the main character, Michael, who is a student who spends a lot of time wrestling with the question of Germany and its political future. So that gives us a background on what we're dealing with here. I guess maybe we can start with just impressions of the book and general thoughts about it. So, Sean, do you want to go ahead and tell us what you thought?
Yeah, sure. Well, I suppose that taking the form of a diary, it is successful in terms of realism. I would believe it as if it were an actual diary of a bright young man with aspirations that are not quite formed yet and thoughts moving in a ton of different directions, possessed by strong aspirations.
Well, so one observation that I had about it was obviously, like you mentioned, and again, just for the audience, we'll not hold back really from giving any spoilers about the book, although the storyline is, I think, not that important here, as is the political content, at least in Goebbels' mind and in his intention. But one thing that I felt from reading it is obviously, like you mentioned, the character really wrestles with some issues of ideology and politics, and thinking about the condition of Germany and how it might be overcome. And I don't feel that the book, like within the course of the book, he comes to an answer that is well fleshed out and explicitly fleshed out. By the end of it, he feels like he's found something real when he becomes a worker and he becomes accepted by the other workers in the mining town. And he talks as though he's come to a revelation, but I don't think he really specifies it in great detail. I don't know. Would you say that you felt the same?
Yeah, definitely. And I'd say that a lot of it is present from the beginning. But I think that might be something that's inherent to third position politics generally, both for the practical reason that actual active politics had to happen immediately as a counterpoint to the communist threat, and due to the inherent fact that I would almost contest the use of the word ideology to describe our thing, whatever it is, right? Like our thing is about, I'm going to quote from the book, but it's about youth, vitality, life surging out of the tenements, vast green fields shining in 1,000 colors. It's almost more of a feeling than an ideology. It's this a natural and almost instinctive connection to things that are one's own, meaning one's land and one's family. So to me, that's not really a drawback of the book per se. Although perhaps there could have been some character development that allows him to arrive there. But yeah, in essence, I'd agree with what you said.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily think of it as a drawback. I think, if anything, it's kind of like a historical artifact because probably at this point in his life, Goebbels himself, this is some years before he even encountered National Socialism, and his political views, by most accounts, were undergoing a lot of change during this time. So, again, it very much reads like a diary of the author in many ways, in that he's very much wrestling with things, but he hasn't formulated or structured answer. And I think I kind of get your point as well with questioning the use of the word ideology. There's a lot to his perspective and to our perspective that is kind of instinctive, that maybe sometimes defies the need for an immediate philosophical structure. I guess you could fairly say that whatever his beliefs were, or any beliefs, any political beliefs, they don't totally become real or kind of reach their endpoint until they are applied and acted out, in engagement with politics and in, say, real life, I guess, for lack of a better term, which, finally occurred for Goebbels in 1920s, a few years after writing the book.
Yeah, I mean, just to provide some more textual evidence, we have quotes like, "Life itself is not complicated. We're just making it complicated. If you keep your eyes open, you can see straight through it. We make the simplest questions difficult and then brood over them." Or another one is, "The humanities breed arrogance and jargon. Common sense goes to hell. Intellect is a danger to the formation of character." Which is definitely like, oh dang it, I can't remember exactly which Nietzsche text I want to cite here, but there's a whole passage from Nietzsche that brought to mind where he takes Socrates to task and unfavorably compares his petty rationalism to the aristocrat who disdains all such niggling argumentation as sort of beside the point. What the point is to enact your will upon the world and not worry about, constructing these ersatz justifications for what is really like a manifestation of the will, something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a very good way of putting it. Like, that's essentially the synthesis, that enacting of your will upon the world is the synthesis that is ultimately lacking in the book. And at the end of the book, the character dies. He dies in a mining accident, again, like Goebbels' friend did. And obviously, I think a big part of the reason for that plot development is that parallel to real life. But I think another reason for it is, see, I think in the Yeah, at the very end, there's kind of a last entry which is written, in the context of the story by this friend of the characters, just talking about the day of his death. And he finds a passage from Nietzsche that Michael, the character, has marked. Many die too late and some die too early. The lesson still sounds strange, die at the right time. And I think you could fairly say that there's another sense in which this was, I guess, in kind of like a meta sense, a death of the character at the right time, because as we're discussing, he had kind of come to some sort of epiphany, but he had not reached that synthesis of enacting his will upon the world, and in so doing away with those fears and tensions of not having everything exactly figured out. And again, that was because Goebbels himself did not reach that synthesis until years later.
Have you ever heard that Walter Benjamin quote? I'm going to paraphrase it rather than quote it. I'm going to butcher it. But he said something to the effect of the essence of the left is the politicization of aesthetics, whereas the essence of the right is the aestheticization of politics. Politics as a work of monumental art. I mean, obviously, Walter Benjamin is no friend of ours, but I think that's one of those things where I might do a Chad face response and be like, yes, that is what we are doing, correct. And this is a thing that shows up. It's a thing that shows up as a question in Michael as well. Quoting from on page 35 here. And the specific quote I'm looking at is, "You also think artistically in politics. This is sometimes dangerous for one's own life and progress." Who is he talking to here? Is this Herta Holk?
I believe so, yes. Yeah, he
Uh-huh.
has very kind of rationalist philosophical conversations with women and everyone else in his life in this book.
It's that is, yes, a bit of a thing that doesn't come across as realistic.
Yeah. Well, so I think this is a jumping off point for at least two other thoughts that I had to consider. So maybe let's start with the one that's maybe most controversial, which is relating to the way that the book is written. And it's kind of like you said earlier, some of it can be excused as a diary form. So this is a person's thoughts that they're writing down, so they could be overly eloquent, overly philosophical, and so on. But his conversations with people are the same. They're all very pointed, like they all exist in order to discuss philosophical ideas in the way that may not always be how people actually talk.
Yeah.
And he himself says at one point that art for art's sake is a sin in the German conception of art. So he has clearly a very strong opinion that art should have a point, in this case, a philosophical or political point. So what do you think about that? Where do you stand on that issue?
I'm very much against, in my own art, I'm constantly trying to be less pointed and less propagandistic. I'm kind of on the other end of that spectrum. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's sort of an inherent tension to art, and we shouldn't try to resolve it one way or another, because I suppose I agree that art for art's sake, empty experiments in form, that ends up becoming, masturbatory. It's art to impress other artists. It doesn't inspire an audience. It doesn't create this feeling of catharsis or moral clarification or philosophical enlightenment. I don't really see the point of that. That ends up becoming empty in one way. But when you subjugate art to, expressing some political or philosophical purpose, then it's propaganda. And I would say, like, why not just write a philosophical treatise if that's what you're doing? So yeah, I suppose my answer is that this is an inherent tension that we shouldn't try and resolve. You have to do both at once, and it's impossible, and you'll never get it right. And that's what makes art so damn frustrating. And then I suppose the other thing that I'd say about it is that the advantage that art has over more explicit formulations of politics and philosophy is that by telling stories, you have the ability to reach out beyond what you're able to explicitly formulate and sort of hint at something that you couldn't otherwise put into words. And it's a very fragile thing, and maybe your reader grasps it for a second, but then when they try to put their hands on it and make it concrete, it collapses into sand. that I think is like the essence of art, that you like, you can point to an ideal, you can point to some moral, political, philosophical, existential truth without saying it. Yeah, no, but I think that, if I was gonna criticize Goebbels on this count, then I'd say that he veers towards the propagandistic type of error, where the fact that the art is so clearly subordinated to the political ultimately makes certainly the dialogues come off a little bit flat and not human.
Yeah, I mean it is a difficult and perennially interesting question to consider, how do art and what your own beliefs are, how much you should want to get them across, what's the best way of doing so. But yeah, I think the dialogue here is definitely an example of putting the message over the form. The letters I think are a bit better. That's a little bit more natural to believe that, someone would write letters in that way.
You said there were two jumping off points.
Yeah, the other thing that I was thinking of was maybe we could just consider his relationships in the book, which I think might be fair to say are a little bit of a mirror of Goebbels' own personality and his relationships with women specifically. So Michael meets this lovely lady named Hertha Holk while he's studying, and they fall in love. I'm not sure if they get married or not. As I remember, it's not that specifically stated. There was a passage that I thought read a lot like a proposal, but there's no description of a marriage. But in any case, ultimately they don't work out. Michael becomes very consumed by his work. He is writing a play in which Jesus Christ is the main character. And there's not much more description of the content of the play or the storyline of the play. I think he says at one point that the Greek gods are also a character. It's basically, it serves as a means through which Goebbels discusses Christianity and its his beliefs about it, its impact on his life, and its relationship to Germany and German nationalism. But anyway, yeah, Michael spends a lot of time writing this play, and he also becomes depressed because he cannot figure out the answer to the question of Germany's future, or what he should do about it. And Hertha becomes increasingly frustrated with him, and then eventually leaves him because she says that he's not providing her with this sense of stability anymore, and just also doesn't have time for her. So there's another female character named Agnes, who's a artist that shows up about maybe halfway through the book, and she's a minor but steady character throughout the rest of it. She's present at Michael's funeral. And there's no sign of like a romantic relationship between them, although he does appreciate her. But again, from looking at Goebbels' own life, he did marry in 1931, I believe. He had several affairs, so did his wife. They stayed together partly due to Hitler's own intervention. But yeah, I did feel that it kind of provided kind of like a little bit of a mirror. And there's also, I think, a similarity in that Goebbels was similarly concerned as Michael is in the story with worrying that his political career or his aspirations or his ability to live out his ideals would be compromised by the kind of total devotion that a relationship with a woman would require. Yeah, so that's one of the parallels that I felt that I saw.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that there's that aspect of it, right, where in practical terms, the absorption with politics in Germany ends up making a relationship impossible, and yet on an abstract level, he's kind of, maybe obsessed is a strong word, but he continually returns to the sort of sacred duty of motherhood, the veneration of motherhood, as one of these foundations of the nation. Especially early on in the book, I remember him repeatedly referring to motherhood sort of in the same catalog of things as
Yeah,
the rolling fields of the smell of the grass and the crops. It's one of these natural facts that animates his politics, and I would say my politics at least, to a much greater extent than any sort of like, abstract stuff written down about class structures and economic relations and I don't know, skull shapes or whatever. It
Uh-huh.
comes much more from this natural stuff that you can feel and smell and
Yeah,
taste.
he has an argument with Hertha about it at one point. To me, I found that actually one of the funniest passages where that was one of the parts where I felt most could have been taken from some like a modern day conversation with a kind of like well intentioned, but like someone who hasn't quite worked out their messaging, like young right wing man talking to a woman about how she needs to value motherhood, and she's kind of like not entirely opposed, but not entirely on the same page. She calls him a reactionary, and Michael says, well, that's maybe I am a reactionary. I hate the modern world. So it's kind of a funny part. Yeah, he says that being a mother, every father who makes children and a mother who raises men is a political being. So yeah, he does talk in many places in the book about the importance of motherhood, and kind of makes it all the more interesting and to consider that he himself, the character, doesn't value it enough to sustain a relationship that would enable him to make a mother out of this woman or himself become a father. Yeah, I don't know if you would consider that a contradiction necessarily, but it is there.
Maybe it's a contradiction of what you're trying to produce is an ideologically consistent propaganda tract, right? If you're trying to do socialist realism in the Stalinist molds, then sure, it's a contradiction. But that reads to me as one of the more like believable human things. I think that that's kind of like an inherent tragedy of being like an extremist in our way of being an extremist, right? Because so much of our thing is about social
I
cohesion.
like the word radical better than extremist.
Fair. I haven't really given it any thought, but we can do that. But yeah, my point being that if you value social cohesion and traditional bonds. I mean, I think it's very important for a functional society to have like strict social controls on the things that people think and say. I think that it's good that there are taboos and that like the social with a capital S comes together to sort of force conformity to healthy norms. I believe in all that stuff. And yet in order to be a radical of our ilk, you have to sort of defy the expectations of your social group. You have to become sort of a pariah. There's an irony to being a pariah who is sort of trumpeting the importance of social bonds and traditional mores and stuff. And I think that's an inherent part of
Yeah,
revolting against.
absolutely. It is again perennial issue, and you could call it a kind of contradiction, but it's a question that bears considering. It kind of reminds me of another similar, like, ever-present debate, which again is very much to the point of what we're talking about here, comparing, say, single men in right-wing movements versus men with families. And there can be kind of a little bit of a rivalry between the two over which one's more important. And you can kind of see both sides. Like, is it men with families because they are living out the future that they want to see and they have a more of an investment in it through their children, or is it single men because they are devoting more of their life to the cause and they're able to do things that men with families would be more reticent or less likely to do? So I think it's probably a question that can't ultimately be resolved, but there's valid points to both sides.
For sure. Do we have anything else on this, or do we want to talk about Russians?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so in Munich, Michael's studying at the university. He ends up making the acquaintance of a philosophy student named Ivan Vienrovsky, and he's a wholehearted believer in the revolution. He enters the story here on page 28, and one of the first things we hear from Goebbels is, "What a vivacious national feeling! The Russians believe in their future." And there's sort of an ongoing repartee between the two, where Ivan is singing the praises of the Bolshevik Revolution and talking about a post-national humanity, but also at the same time making reference to the ways that that revolution is going to imply like a place of primacy for the Russians that disadvantages Germans. It's going to involve Germans making sacrifices to the benefit of Russians, and ultimately he ends up being sorely disappointed, having incorrectly understood the nature of Bolshevism as in fact an attack on the Russian people by a foreign enemy. And yeah, this encounter leads us to a number of interesting observations on the Russians as a people. Ivan gives him a copy of Dostoevsky's The Idiot, and that's sort of the prism through which Goebbels discusses the Russians as a folk. So I suppose I'll just read us out some passages, and we can use that as fodder for further discussion. Prince Mishkin, the main character of The Idiot, is an unsteady, unpredictable, ridiculous man, an idiot. But that's the way the Russian people are, and that is their real tragic greatness. Short-tempered, abrupt, sudden, endlessly brooding, waiting, hoping, infinitely evil and infinitely good, full of the deepest passions, kind and tender, fantastic in lies as in truth, young and untouched, yet rich in depth, joy, humor, pain, and longing. This is the soul of the Slav, the soul of Russia. So that's, I mean, of course it's an ancient trope, the Zagadolchная русская душа, right? The mysterious Russian soul. And having been in Russia and the general post-Soviet space, there's something true about it there. But yeah, what do we make of the Russians, Taylor?
Well, so I have a personal opinion that is perhaps not well informed enough to justify itself, that I feel like this is an example of it, that when it comes to Russia, there is a unique difficulty for every observer to kind of consider it neutrally. There seems to be like a unique, I don't know, what you would say, impulse to, I don't know, almost like you could almost say have like a sense of insecurity that comes through in attempting to consider Russia or frame Russia. I mean, that's definitely true in some sense here. You know, Michael's insecurity isn't necessarily so much that he's afraid that Russia's going to conquer Germany, although that maybe plays a little bit of a role, but it's more that I think he is challenged by this feeling that Ivan has arrived confidently at a national identity and a political direction to be invested in for the sake of his people, and Michael has not arrived at that for the Germans. But yeah, I don't know. It's like, I mean, you know, you have spent some time there. I have not, so you'd be much better positioned to say so than me. But I always feel like maybe I could say it this way: like, people are uniquely salty about Russia, no matter who they are. Like, no matter where the observer is from, they have this like unique impulse to, even when they're usually, if they're honest, they'll give it some praise, but it's always tempered with like these very uniquely Russian faults, supposedly. And I almost wonder if there's a degree to which like this image of this contradictory, you know, light and dark nature is something that's constructed and like over time kind of imposed itself on the reality of Russia. So I don't know if that makes any sense or if you agree with it or not.
Yeah,
but
a couple things on that. Yeah, so like, first of all, the fact that people relate differently to Russia and Russians than they do to most any other European nation state, I think probably has something to do with the fact. Well, I'll call it a fact. It's my interpretation that today Russia is one of. I could probably think of some other countries that remain relevant historical actors in Europe, but the vast majority of European states have been sort of subsumed into the Zog blob, and they're sort of inert as geopolitical actors. They're not like autonomous actors to the same degree as they once were. So I imagine that like people once would have had a similar inability to speak, with the degree of objective remove about the Germans and the French, because at that point the Germans and the French would have had the potential to exercise significant control on the fate of the nation of the speaker, right? So the speaker would be an interested party. But nowadays, when most of these European nations have been effectively hamstrung and incorporated into the empire, whatever you want to call it, I think it's easier to speak neutrally about, say, Germans than it is about Russians, because Russia is actually, and I don't want to be mistaken for some sort of like Z-anon third worldist BRICS guy who thinks that there's going to be some sort of Eurasian renaissance that the white race can tag along with. I don't believe that. Russia is it has its own problems, let's say, but I think to a much greater degree they are an independent geopolitical actor, and maybe that has something to do with it.
Yeah, certainly. I would say, in my opinion, I think that it's what I was describing is not necessarily such a modern thing. And I think in that sense, it's probably related to Russia always having been kind of a foot in and a foot out of Europe. It's never been quite the same. And I don't want to take that too far either, because you see that taken like really far, especially like today in relation to the Ukraine war. There's editorials and stuff from mainstream papers and politicians talking about Russia as like these Mongol hordes that are completely alien to Europe. So I think that is also vastly incorrect. But at the same time, Russia has been always more different, I think, from the European countries than they have been from each other. And also they're very close neighbors. They're nestled right in together, whereas there's a lot of land between them and Russia. There's a lot of land in Russia between it and the rest of Europe. So I think there is also a sense to which it's always been somewhat its own civilization, even at times when it was more European than others.
Yeah, man. I mean, the example that I'll give, it's a little linguistic nugget, but in Russian, when Russians speak about Europe, it's always like a place that's over there. They don't speak of Russia as being part of Europe. They speak of Russia and Europe. Europe is that place over to the west, somewhere exterior to them, which doesn't mean that they're whatever Western civilization and Christendom as totally alien things. It's like you said, one foot in, one foot out. A friend of mine once said, response to a question about I asked about the trope of the mystery wrapped in a riddle, wrapped in an enigma, the Churchill quote, right? The mysterious Russian soul. And this friend of mine was like, hey, I don't know that we're that mysterious, but we probably seem that way to you because we are visually white, and yet we are so different because of, now I'm editorializing a little bit, but it's a fact that several centuries of Turco-Muslim Mongol occupation under the Golden Horde did make them very different. So maybe it's just the theory of my friend was that like it's that we look so similar to you and yet we are so different. That's what makes us seem so mysterious.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's certainly a great sense of tragedy and like these huge ups and downs in Russian history as well. So, the characterization is definitely not entirely unfair either. And I think maybe like to return it to considering the book, again, if you look at Ivan's case and you think about Russia in the 20th century and how it experience these tremendous tragedies and bloodshed. And at the same time, over time, there was a clawing back of sovereignty by the Russian people within the Soviet state. It still nevertheless like left the legacy in many people's minds that this was a Russian empire and helped maintain Russia as a separate and independent civilization of the liberal West. So there's a lot of bad, but there's also silver linings to it as well. Although, like you noted, ultimately, the character Ivan's own kind of maybe somewhat misplaced faith in the revolution ends up betrayed.
I'll just draw your attention to page 30 going over to page 31. It seems it's having come from sort of a liberal Western context where people think in terms of ideology, and the Soviet Union is explained in terms of communist doctrine. I think that it's pretty impressive how he sees through that facade of ideology to the national miracle, the Russian national miracle below the veneer of communism. He says that which you call international in Russia is a mixture of Jewish rabble, cowardly blood terror, and the boundless tolerance of the broad masses, hoisted onto the stage of geopolitics by the outstanding will of a single man, Lenin. Right. So that's the surface level understanding that has, I would say, up until the present day, remained the dominant interpretation of the Soviet Union in the West. But yes, there as you discussed, there was this clawing back of national sovereignty, this exercising of the national will within the vocabulary of the Soviet Union, where it is true that it did at certain times in its history become something like a Russian empire, something where the Russians did exercise their national will and maintain this autonomous sort of maintain their own autonomous thing, which you wouldn't see that if you only think in terms of the surface level, what people are saying, what arguments they make. The Soviets, the Russians, even Russians today speak in Soviet terms, especially older people who were raised in that sort of thing, which is why you see this weird schizophrenic justification of the Ukraine war as having something to do with, the fight of the noble Soviet Union against fascism.
Yeah, like denazification.
Right.
One of my greatest frustrations with of like modern political phenomenon.
Yeah, man, it's an irritating one. But yeah, the point being that it's a cool moment in the book because it shows how having this third position, having your politics be rooted in what is natural and primary and intuitive, allows you to see through some of these facades that liberals and leftists often get tangled up in.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to go back for a second to this point that eventually the Soviet Union became, less of a Jewish state, and there was more of an expression of the Russian ethnic or racial sovereignty. I don't remember who it was, if it was Brezhnev or someone else, but towards the end of the Soviet Union, you had this interesting, basically, inversion with the liberal West, where I think it was a meeting with Thatcher. I think it's not entirely clear, but I think it was with Thatcher where said, if we don't put aside our differences and start working together, then the white race is going to be destroyed. And I think Thatcher was shocked to hear that, and a trajectory that the Soviet Union was, kind of very in its own way lumbering towards, whereas the liberal West was careening in the exact opposite direction.
Yeah, well, and that's another one of those endlessly frustrating things where, it's true that we see these healthy attitudes much better preserved in the former Soviet Union and satellite states. And yet at the same time, like if you pay attention to Russian language public discourse, it is just the Soviet version of anti-racism, multiculturalism, and maximizing the number of Uzbeks and Tajiks that the vested interests, the oligarchs, can import into the federation while keeping the regular people quiet, who are very not happy about it.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting subject, and perhaps maybe one that we'll consider in more detail at a later time. But just to go back to what you were saying, so we can keep moving forward with the book, I think in that passage that you read, I think it is fair to read. Clearly, there's a lot of condemnation of what happened in Russia. You have Jewish rabble, cowardly blood terror, boundless tolerance of the broad masses. But I think in the way that it's all phrased, you can fairly detect a hint of admiration for what is ultimately a titanic achievement in purely a historical sense.
And you see this throughout the conversations with Viennarovsky. There's almost a note of seduction to it, where he keeps showing up like this enticing demon figure.
Yeah, he makes it a little weird. In fact, at one point, I think he asks Michael to be his slave.
Yes, he does. Which again is first of all is a big difference from the caricatured notion of German supremacist who looks down on everything Slavic and sees them as subhuman. You definitely don't see that here.
It's a tremendous caricature, and it's this kind of partial admiration while at the same time ultimate rejection of things like Marxism is a pretty consistent feature throughout all the European fascist movements, Germany, Italy, Spain, and so on. They all kind of had this in common, that they saw some value in these things. They used them kind of as tools to an end while ultimately rejecting them fundamentally.
Yeah, well, and there's the fundamental agreement across third position movements that capitalism, in the sense of rule by money, is something that needs to be opposed, even if you don't have to go, even if you can find a third way that doesn't involve the abolition of capital and markets, because those are useful tools. But yeah, as a side note, that's like me paraphrasing him, and the way that he put that is so similar to the way that some of our guys talk about it. It almost can't be a coincidence, which was pretty cool. And that distinction between capitalism, like the rule by money, and the existence of capital as a tool, that was one of the things that sort of broke me out of the strictures of my economic ideology that remained in place for quite a bit of time, even after I had thought that I had quit libertarianism. I still had some innate aversion to words like socialism and anti-capitalism, and this line of argument was one of the things that sort of opened my mind on some of those questions. Dang it, how did I get here? This was a side note, but I got my main point.
Well, if you think of your main point, we can return to it, but this was kind of the direction that I wanted to go. So he does spend some of the time in the book talking about not just socialism versus capitalism, but also left-wing socialism or Marxist socialism versus nationalist socialism, or honestly, at one point he even talks about it as Christian socialism. I don't know, what did you think about those in this context?
Do you have a page or a citation?
Yeah, well, I guess I can maybe start talking about it. So let me find the portion. So basically, at one point, he kind of makes the distinction between Marxist socialism and his socialism, which he also compares with, or he finds inspiration for from Christianity and from Jesus, and he basically compares it as Marxist socialism is theft, whereas Christian socialism is self-sacrifice. So he says on page 80, for example, distribute your goods to the poor, Christ. Property is theft as long as it is not mine, Marx. Christian socialism means voluntarily and willingly what the Marxist means doing voluntarily and willingly what the Marxist does out of pity or for political gain. Christ, the principle of love, Marx, the principle of hate. So again, you have a consideration of Marxism in the context of rejecting capitalism, but then ultimately a rejection of Marxism as well, because it ultimately is just as materialistic and just as inimical and unsuited to the healthy life of a nation and a collective.
It's interesting because I feel like pity gets, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like pity is more or less commensurable with Christianity. It's certainly a unusual interpretation of Christianity that Dr. Goebbels has here. How do you think that pity fits in with Christianity? Or how does it differ from the charitable impulse?
Well, he says you're right. I mean, so he attributes the pity to Marx, but you're saying it could also be fairly kind of seen as a Christian impulse as well. It seems to me like he's probably thinking of pity in like a very specifically negative interpretation that doesn't necessarily come from positive impulse of seeing someone as a brother in need. I don't know. I mean, I'm doing my best here, but it is I think probably hit upon something that I don't have a clear and ready answer for. I mean, you're right to say it's an interesting interpretation of Christianity. I mean, question of Goebbels' relationship with Christianity and, more broadly speaking, National Socialism's relationship with Christianity is a very controversial and complex one that we don't necessarily need to go down entirely. But even in this book, you have the main character, his opinion on Christianity develops over time. He seems to kind of be a little not fed up, but he's sours on it a little bit early on, and then I think through the second half comes to appreciate a lot in Christianity. He seems to come back to Christ, maybe not entirely in theologically orthodox Christian sense, but definitely to an appreciation of Christianity and its value for Germany. But he spends a lot of time, I think, talking about Christianity and talking about Christ as, again, as an example for the kinds of politics that he finds valuable. Self-sacrifice as well as eternal truth. He talks about at one point how the Jews, in crucifying Christ, crucified truth itself. So I think it's not the most thorough examination of this subject, but it's a little bit of an interesting mirror into considering Goebbels and National Socialism's relationship with Christian theology.
Yeah, right now I'm looking at page 46, where he says, "I commune with Christ. I thought I had overcome him, but that was only his idolatrous priests and false servants. Christ is hard and relentless. He whips the Jewish merchants out of the temple, a declaration of war on money. You're going to jail or a madhouse if you say that today." Maybe part of that is that any sort of archetypal figure. I guess in short, there's enough faces of Jesus presented in Scripture that you could draw a picture that fits most things, which is not like me trying to. I'm not dogging Christianity here. I'm just saying you could twist it to any sort of purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I also like the phrase or the sentence right after the part you just read. Only fighting the rot can save us once more. Again, that's on page 46. So there's a lot that is interesting, that is not always entirely theologically orthodox. Again, speaking myself from a Christian perspective here in his thoughts on Christ, but I think there is also a lot that is admirable as well, even from a Christian perspective, and that is genuine. And I think that he's looking here for solutions to the questions that he's wrestling with regarding his people and regarding Germany. And he does see in Christ an inspiration in many ways. In this particular passage, a kind of like a very pointed political inspiration of driving out the Jews. But again, with that sentence, only fighting the rot can save us once more, is something that I think it's a good way of encapsulating something I think about often. Your faith, or if you're a person of faith, should be something that drives you to fight and that drives you to action. It's dead otherwise. There's a quote I particularly like from another book of ours, the collection of writings by Patrick Pearse, the Irish nationalist, where he says, "A man cannot truly be at peace with God or be a follower of God if he is not at war with the powers of evil." And I guess just to wrap up this subject, there's another portion on page 147 where he says, "Again, I come to Christ." His conclusion is the German question about God cannot be separated from Christ. And he goes on to talk about the necessity of religion in general for a people. He says a people without religion is like a people without breath. So again, a fair, thorough discussion that the subject would deserve of the relationship between National Socialism and Christianity is way outside the scope of what we're talking about here. But, again, as a window into Goebbels' life, you have that, at least at this point, he values religion as a part of the collective health of a people, and he does see Christianity as something that is compatible with the German people. So do you have a topic that we want to move on to from here?
Yeah, well, maybe we could talk more about class, right? Because we were on different views of socialism before we got on the religious aspect. I think it's an interesting thing. I don't quite know what to make of it.
Yeah, he has I don't know if you have had something you wanted to go off of there with, but there was a particularly interesting portion where he talks about class. It's on page 119, so it's nearer to the end, and he seems to have this tension where he's wrestling with perhaps a more Marxist view of class, and he's coming to identify more with the working class, but he seems to specifically not want to end up like the Marxist and not want to end up with the conclusion of just a class war. So he says, money has enslaved us, work will set us free. We tumbled into the abyss with the political bourgeois, but we will rise again with the political workers. And he's talking to Agnes here, and she replies, "You are opponents of the class struggle and yet preach the rule of a class." And so he replies, "The working class is not a class. Class comes from economics. The working class has its root in politics. It is a historical state." So he seems to be wanting to connect or to use the working class to mean something not just like the miners that he ends up working with. He seems to want to connect it to, I guess, like the spirit of the nation in some way, or like a better representation of the nation as a whole than the bourgeois class has become at that point. So that was, I thought, was one of the more interesting passages on the subject of class in the book.
Yeah, I agree.
Where did you want to go with it? Is there a particular section that stood out to you in discussing class?
I mean, I was on page 61. Maybe I think it fits reasonably well with the passage you introduced. It's also interesting that there's a certain resemblance to Marxism in the sense that Marx presents the periodic class revolutions as being sort of a structural feature, right? Like the preeminence of the bourgeoisie over the aristocrats is sort of an inevitability given the contradictions of the aristocratic class structure. And as Marx predicts incorrectly, due to the contradictions of capitalism, it is inevitable that the working class will rise up to supplant the bourgeoisie. There's an interesting thing here where he says that a class has fulfilled its historical mission and is about to step down before the creative will of a new young class. The bourgeoisie is giving away as the working class is advancing. It has nothing to do with jobs. This finds its final decision in the mental attitude. You don't become a citizen, you are a citizen. So I suppose what's interesting to me here, I guess it's kind of all about the contrast between money and work, right? Like the bourgeoisie is all about this, like acquiring excess wealth and luxury and things like that, whereas the way that he understands the working class, there's like a glory to work and struggle that goes above and beyond the leisure that you can purchase as a result of it.
Yeah, and I think above occupation, in a sense, you read the part where he says it has nothing to do with jobs. So I think it goes back to what I think we were talking a little bit about earlier, talking about money and its corrosive effect on the national character and just the collective health of a nation state. And it's something that he talks about as well. He says that liberalism is the belief in money. Money teaches selfishness. It's something that inherently corrupts the soul of the individual and the nation. I think what he's saying overall is the economic class of the bourgeois has become something that really has no organic connection to Germany as an entity anymore. It's become representative of nothing else but the corrupting power of money. And the true working class is not so much necessarily like only people in certain professions, people who work in the mines or dockyards or whatever else, but it's, I guess, a representation of a life that values work. And that is, I think, also how he describes his socialism, that he believes in work, not entirely in the Marxist sense of, the only value comes through the worker and that's how you measure value and all that. But you need to work to have dignity and to have a fulfilling life. And through that, to have an opportunity to sacrifice for others, which again is something that's very important to him. So I think you see in that kind of proto version, I guess, of the fascist or national socialist or third positionist synthesis of class cooperation instead of class warfare.
I was having some difficulties with this sort of valorization of the working class because I don't necessarily see actuality this great difference where the working class is this ideal of people working for. I think they're just as driven by money as the bourgeoisie, but maybe the response to that would be that this is an aspiration. We want the victory of the working class over money. We want to change the working class into something that encompasses everybody, right? But it also involves people finding like purpose and value in performing one's duties. I don't know. I guess I've just
Well,
I
I think that it's absolutely fair to say that the working class itself can be and is and was in that era just as corrupted in many ways as anyone else. And in fact, I kind of noticed the only time he really gives, to my memory, a negative description of people is at the end when he comes to Schliersee, to this mining town, and he's living with these working class people, these miners and their families in these squalid conditions. And that I don't remember exactly what he says, but I believe that was the only time where he made like a negative description of the character of these people as a whole. And to me, I felt that it really paralleled Mein Kampf in a section where Hitler talked about how he went to Vienna and he was very poor at the time. He worked as construction worker or something like that. You know, he had a very working class existence there for a time. And he talks about how thoroughly morally degenerated the German urban working class is, and how these are actually, like, a lot of them are just awful people. They're drunkards, they beat their wives, they have no sense of thrift, no ability to plan for the future or take care of themselves or like be responsible with their money or anything like that. But they also have, nevertheless, he sees some virtues that shine through that, and ultimately his conclusion is that he values them because they're his people, and he can't stand to see them in this condition, and they have to be saved from this being the condition that they live in. They're not going to be able to do it themselves on an individual level, which, as a little bit of a side note, I think is a terrific condemnation of modern libertarian conservatism. But I felt that that was a very interesting similarity that I saw in Michael, where he wants kind of like an aspirational miner, I guess, like an aspirational working class man. He like decides that this is part of the synthesis of his political development, is becoming a worker by going down into the mines, and he really wants these people to accept him. All at the same time, he does note that, you know, there's a lot that's really not great about their life. So I think it goes to what you were saying, that, you know, the working class as an economic class can be, and often is, just as degenerated as everybody else. And I think when Michael, and Goebbels through Michael, is talking about, or is elevating the working class, I think it's again, it's kind of like you were saying, what he's elevating is not necessarily like a strictly defined economic class of people, but he's elevating like the value of work to a people in general, and seeking to return it to a more honest and dignifying form, and do away with the corruption of work that comes from the rule of money. So that would be my thoughts on it, I guess.
Yeah. Did you ever read that book Coming Apart by Charles Murray? It's about the class structure of America, basically. One of the
I
things
have not.
it's a good one, first of all, but one of the things that I remember from that is just a little quote where he says that the problem with the bourgeoisie is that they don't preach what they practice, right? It's the opposite of the usual cliche. Where actually, I don't know, maybe I'm just defending bourgeois morality here. I think there's a lot of good stuff there. Thrift and the planning ahead and stable families relative to the working class. I don't know. I guess maybe I just don't understand where all the hate for the bourgeoisie comes from. And then when it comes from, like, talk about like the sort of the cowardice of the bourgeoisie and their willingness to go along with all sorts of oppressive conditions if it doesn't threaten their status, then it seems to me that the antidote to that, the thing that allows people to rise above excessive worry about their material conditions, is nobility of spirit or an interest in things that are not material, that I would associate more with the aristocracy. I don't know. Maybe I'm a dumb guy, but I've always found the lower class identification of the interwar third position movements to be odd and not to my innate sensibilities. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being a very online neo-reactionary guy.
No, I mean, I think my understanding is that, you know, this is something that was this consideration was something that was a very big part of the philosophical formation of the fascist movements. There's so many of them that started from a Marxist background and this like workers' revolution background, like Mussolini, for example, and they ultimately ended up rejecting it. And I think that there's a lot to consider there. There's a lot to think about and a lot to talk about in everything that you've brought up. I mean, maybe to return it for a second to consideration of like the modern middle class in America and how they don't preach what they practice. I mean, that's a very good observation. I mean, I think the first thing I think of is you consider how loss of sexual morality and morality around the family formation and the traditional family is something that has really hit like the poor and working class the worst. But it didn't come from them. It came from the top. So, that's kind of what's preached by a lot of liberal upper class people or middle class. It's kind of a middle class value, this kind of like sexual liberation. But at the same time, like when it comes down to it, they do actually have families and they do have marriages and stable marriages. And like it filters down to the working class and they're kind of like the joke is on them because, this isn't an idea that was kind of natural to those people, but they end up the worse for it. So
like another example being it's a cliche at this point, but the Democrat voting pro-diversity person who sends their kid to a private Montessori school. It pervades.
Yeah, exactly.
It pervades bourgeois behavior.
Yeah. So ultimately, you can't. Again, this is the whole problem that the fascists and the National Socialists and other nationalists ended up identifying with Marxism is that it just wants to have a class war, and ultimately, you can't try to do away with all the classes in society for the benefit of just one. There's aristocracy is kind of inherently like a right wing concept or a right wing class, but at the same time, you had a lot of the aristocracy. It's traditionally very reactionary, very conservative, and ultimately opposed to the more revolutionary fascist movements. So, these are the people who kind of like stand by and they sit by and they let the nation degrade and come to near ruin, but they kind of get up and they get all flustered when someone tries to do something about it. But again, there's always going to be some form of an aristocracy in society, no matter how that society is structured. And traditionally, they're probably fair to say that there was some, the aristocracy had better, for lack of a better term, I guess, like human capital that was contained within it. So yeah, I guess to just maybe kind of I feel like we're probably beating the dead horse here, but to close out the topic, I think that again this is very much I think what Michael and by extension Goebbels is wrestling with. There's kind of this intrinsic maybe impulse of justice and fairness that wants to identify with the downtrodden worker, but at the same time he realizes that they're not necessarily any better people, they're not necessarily any less corrupted by capitalism, and ultimately a vision of just class warfare is no better, no less destructive to the nation than one of slavery to capitalism. But yeah, I don't know if you want to comment on that anymore or take it somewhere else from here.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna say. Like maybe we can draw some conclusions. I mean,
yeah, I think this is probably a good time to stop. Maybe we've discussed a lot about the book. There's still more in it, and for you, the reader, to check out on your own. But I guess final thoughts. So, Sean, you go ahead.
All
If
right.
you want to go first.
For sure. Yeah, I would say that Michael is an imperfect work that is certainly interesting from a historical perspective. It's also interesting prose level. Goebbels does have some wonderful turns of phrase, aphorisms, and bits of poeticness that I quite enjoyed. To me, maybe the most interesting part of it was getting an idea from a primary source of where some of the vocabulary that comes out of my mouth sometimes actually originates from. I think to a larger extent than I appreciated before reading this book, there is direct intellectual inheritance between National Socialism and general third positionism and whatever you want to call our thing. it felt good. It felt comfy to come across these ideas almost a century removed from when they were originally put down on paper, and recognize myself in there, recognize some of the conclusions that I've come to without ever really much engaging with the texts of National Socialism. Some of the insights that I have come to by reading people in other traditions, in particular, the vitalism and the connection to the sort of visceral, intuitive, natural, primal realities of being a person rather than egghead intellectual ideological stuff. That has been one of the most powerful tools for cutting through nonsense that I've acquired in the past couple of years, and it was cool to realize that there's actually nothing new under the sun, and Goebbels was thinking and writing similar things that are very prescient nowadays 100 years before. I would definitely recommend it as an interesting thing to engage with, even with its literary imperfections.
Yeah, absolutely. I would also recommend it. Again, in some ways, it's not in the style of a traditional novel, but it is good reading nevertheless. I mean, just the story in itself is interesting, but obviously, as we've been discussing, there's a lot more to it than the story, and really, the story is meant by the author to be a vehicle for consideration of ideas. And one of the ways in which it's most interesting related to that is it functions as a mirror into Goebbels' own life and part of his life where he was going through a lot of intellectual and philosophical development. And again, one of the most interesting things to me is this feeling of this very intense wrestling with the questions that confront him as a patriotic German and not entirely coming to a conclusion by the end of it, because again, the author himself had not really come to a satisfactory conclusion at that point. So it is very interesting as a historical artifact and as a kind of like Sean was saying, like a primary source to a historical period, but also makes for good reading. So would recommend everyone to check it out. And until next time.